I walked out of the office building on a Friday afternoon, carrying a small cardboard box with a few personal items. A framed family photo, an old coffee mug, and a tiny cactus plant that a colleague had given me for my birthday. Nearly 20 years of career packed neatly into my arms. The HR manager spoke to me with a tone so gentle it felt hollow. "We have to restructure. It's not about your performance, Ralph. You've done a great job." I gave a polite smile. A 48-year-old administrative woman. In a company shifting toward modern technologies, I was simply not part of the picture they were trying to redraw. That evening, dinner at home went on as usual. I mentioned I had just left my job. Before I could talk about what I planned to do next, my son looked up from his phone and smirked. "What are you going to do now? Get a new job? At your age?" My daughter giggled. "Maybe you should just retire and relax. Thinking about starting over now?" I looked at them. The ones I had once taught to ride a bike, stayed up all night with when they had fevers, now staring at me like I was just an outdated mother. In their eyes, I was no longer a pillar, no longer a role model. Just someone who had lost the last bit of value she held in the world. I stayed silent because I knew, if I said anything then I would cry. That night, I sat by the kitchen table and made a pot of hot tea. I looked around the house I had worked so hard to pay for. I thought of my mother, who used to bake cookies every Christmas, the smell of butter filling our tiny kitchen. For the first time in years, I opened the old notebook she had left me. Recipes written in slanted handwriting, some pages faded with oil and time. I thought maybe it's time to return to something that truly belongs to me. To start again, this time on my own terms. The oven in my kitchen is over 10 years old. The glass door is slightly cracked, it heats up slowly, and sometimes it makes a low buzzing sound when it gets too hot. But it's what I have, and in the early days after leaving my job, that's where I began. I took my mother's old butter cookie recipe and tried baking the first batch. The cookies came out golden and fragrant with vanilla and sweet butter, though a bit lopsided and slightly overbaked. I took a bite and it felt like stepping back into childhood, standing on a little wooden stool, playing with dough beside her in the warm kitchen on cold winter afternoons. I snapped a photo of the cookies and posted it on Facebook, writing a short caption. "Tried baking Mom's old recipe again. Who's craving cookies?" I thought it was just a playful post, but to my surprise a few old friends commented saying they wanted to order some. I hesitated for a moment, then said yes. They didn't know. Those were my very first orders since becoming unemployed. I printed homemade labels using my old printer, bought twine from the dollar store. I packed each box of cookies as if it were a gift to myself, a mother trying to rediscover her worth after years of being called just a housewife. On my first delivery day I drove myself. An old sedan with an air conditioner that worked only half the time. The cookies sat in the back seat and I drove slowly, afraid the boxes might shift. I knocked on the door of my first customer, a friend from college. She looked at me and said, "I support you, Ralph. I know you can do this." That evening when I got home, my two kids were eating pizza in the living room. The scent of cookies still lingered in the air, but no one asked how my day went. No one asked how many I sold or how I felt. Maybe to them I was just playing some idle game for aging moms. But I wasn't sad anymore. Every cookie I made, every dollar I earned felt like a small piece of self-worth I was quietly picking up, bit by bit. I kept baking every evening after dinner. Sometimes until 1 or 2 a.m. I was still in the kitchen, wiping trays, sealing boxes, replying to messages. Orders grew slowly but steadily. One customer recommended another. A group of young mothers started messaging me for the recipe. A small cafe in town asked if I could supply cookies to them on weekends. And I realized something. Not everyone sees your worth when you start over from scratch. But what matters most is whether you can see it in yourself. Even as the orders slowly increased, there was still not a single word of encouragement in the house I shared with my husband and 2 children. They didn't scold me, but the way they looked at me as if I were chasing some vague hope in the twilight of life, cut deeper than any harsh word could. One morning as I was labeling a fresh batch of cookies for delivery, my son walked past the kitchen table, glanced at it, then sneered. "You really think baking a few cookies here and there counts as a job, Mom?" I looked up at him but didn't say a word. He didn't understand, couldn't understand, that every box of cookies was a refusal to give in, a way to hold myself together against the creeping sense of worthlessness. That night I had just returned home from a local weekend market, The first time I had sold out before the fair ended. When I overheard my daughter talking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was loud and unfiltered. She's making a fool of herself. Who sells handmade cookies at almost 50. Posts silly stuff every day and thinks she's some kind of businesswoman. I stood in the hallway still holding the bag of ingredients. My heart felt like it was being crushed. I had raised them with every ounce of love I had, and now they were the first to doubt me when I needed belief the most. I didn't walk into her room, didn't ask why she said that. Instead, I went upstairs, opened my laptop and checked the new orders coming in on the little website I had just launched. One customer from another state had ordered 10 boxes and left a note. I've never had a cookie that reminded me of my mom like this. Thank you. I read those words again and again as if they were medicine for a swollen heart. Somewhere, someone far away was feeling the love I had poured into each cookie. Kept going. Quietly. Steadily. Then one rainy day in June, I received a message from a local newspaper editor. They wanted to write about me, a middle-aged woman who started over after losing her job, with a handmade cookie business full of memory and heart. The article made the front page of the Women Who Inspire section. They called me the Cookie Comeback. I showed the article to my husband and kids. They skimmed it for a few seconds then stayed silent. No compliments. No proud smiles. But I didn't need them anymore. I had learned how to stand tall without leaning on anyone. Inside me, a small fire had begun to burn. Not the fire of anger but the steady light of determination. I knew that if I kept going like this, one day the whole world and my family would have no choice but to see me. I received an email from a local women's entrepreneurship program. They were hosting a small competition for creative businesses founded by women over 40. I hesitated for a few days before finally deciding to apply. My presentation was simple. No fancy charts, no technical jargon. Just pictures of my cookies, my cramped little kitchen, a few numbers showing how orders had grown, and the story of a 48-year-old mother who once lost her job, was laughed at by her own family, but still chose to start over, one cookie batch at a time. I ended my presentation with one honest sentence. I'm not doing this to prove anything to anyone. I just want people like me, who've been told they're past their prime, to know this. As long as you're alive, you can start again. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the applause came. I never expected to win second prize. The award came with a small grant, just enough for me to rent a commercial kitchen in my old neighborhood. A clean, dedicated space with industrial ovens, long tables and shiny stainless steel shelves. No longer just my cramped little kitchen. I named the shop Sweet Age, a play on words, both sweet age and sweet at any age. The name made me smile every time I saw it on the small sign. White background, dark brown letters hanging just outside the glass door. We opened on a Sunday. Old friends, a few neighbors and online customers. More people came than I expected. Some brought flowers, some came with their kids, and they all greeted me with warm, familiar eyes. My son didn't come. My daughter didn't either. They said they were busy. My husband sent a short text, "Good luck." I stood behind the counter wearing a new apron, holding the cookie tongs, smiling at each customer. There was no anger in my heart. Only calm, the kind that comes after a long journey of doubt and quiet resilience. From that day on, things began to change. A large cafe in town offered me a wholesale contract. I hired 2 young women. One was a single mother, the other was studying baking. Less than a year later, I opened a second location. Then a third. Each store was small but tidy, warm, and always filled with the familiar scent of butter and cinnamon. People didn't just come for cookies. They came to hear a story. The story of a woman who didn't give up, even when the world around her said it was too late. I'm not rich. I'm not famous. But I know I'm living a full life, with my own hands and my own quiet perseverance. 3 years had passed since the day I walked out of that office with a small cardboard box. Now I sat in a small meeting room behind the third Sweet Age store, my hair streaked with a few more grays, but my hands still steady as I mixed dough and packed each box of cookies. I no longer had to stay up late doing everything on my own. I had a small team, women who had once been rejected because of their age, their circumstances, or just life itself. We worked together, shared afternoon teas, talked about our children, about the years we felt overlooked, and about the quiet strength it took to stand back up. One late afternoon, the shop phone rang. The receptionist peeked in. "There's a man asking for you." He says, "He's your son. Name's Alex." I paused for a moment. It had been a long time since Alex last visited the shop. He never asked about my work. Occasionally he'd send a message, but it was always brief, polite, distant. I nodded, told them to let him in. Alex walked in wearing a white shirt, his tie slightly askew as if he'd just left a meeting. He hesitated for a moment when he saw me standing behind the reception desk, hands still dusted with flour. I smiled, took off my gloves, wiped my hands with a towel and invited him to sit. "How have you been, son?" I asked gently. "I'm okay, Mom. Shli. I came here to ask you something." I nodded, waiting. Alex looked down at his hands, fiddled with his phone, then spoke quickly, as if afraid he'd change his mind. "Emma and we're planning to get married in December. We've made the plans, but the budget's a bit tight. I know your business is doing well, so I wanted to ask, would you be able to help us out a little financially?" The room fell quiet. I looked at my son, the boy who once mocked me, who once laughed at my first cookie, now sitting here asking for help from the woman he once called too old to succeed. I wasn't angry, but I hadn't forgotten. I spoke slowly, warmly, like telling a story. "I remember when I first started baking, you asked what I thought when people laughed at me. I didn't answer then. But now I will. I think everyone at some point gets dismissed or misunderstood. But as long as you don't dismiss yourself, you'll find your way." Alex lowered his head, silent. I continued, "I'm happy you found someone you love. But if you're asking me to sponsor your wedding, my answer is no. Not because I won't help, but because I believe, just like I did, you should write your own story with your own hands." I stood up, poured him a cup of hot ginger tea and set it on the table. "A wedding is the beginning of a journey. Don't let it start with someone else's money, especially from someone once seen as useless." Alex said nothing. But when he stood up to leave, his eyes had changed, no longer proud or dismissive. Instead, there was something small, something quiet, but unmistakable: respect. And I knew, in that moment, I didn't need cookies or awards or revenue. All I needed was that recognition, from the child who once left me to rise alone. One autumn morning, I arrived at the shop earlier than usual. Golden leaves were scattered across the brick walkway in front of the bakery, and the scent of last night's baking still lingered faintly in the air. I sat at the small wooden table by the window, my favorite spot. On the table were a cup of black tea, a worn leather notebook, and an invitation letter from a women's entrepreneurship seminar in the neighboring city. They wanted me to speak about starting over after 45 under the theme, "Begin Again, Owning Your Life When It Feels Too Late." I smiled. I had once been let go from an old office because I was no longer a good fit. Now someone wanted to hear how I turned that very not a good fit into my identity. Outside, a few regulars had stopped by for their morning pastries. An older man with his granddaughter, a nurse rushing to her morning shift, a young mother picking up a box of cookies for the parent-teacher meeting. Each of them left with the sweet scent of butter clinging to their clothes, and that warmed me more than any certificate on the wall ever could. I used to think success was about how much money you made, how many stores you opened. But now I know, success is being able to sit down every morning, take a deep breath and feel no regret. I didn't throw a party for the 3rd anniversary. I didn't post sales numbers online. Instead, I quietly sent a batch of free cookies to each store that day. Every customer received a little extra treat with a handwritten note. I also donated part of that month's profit to a fund that supports older women who've lost their jobs, the same place I once turned to when I was lost and empty-handed. As for Alex, he didn't call to tell me about the wedding. But a few weeks later, I received a small envelope in the bakery's mailbox. "You were right, Mom. We managed on our own. And I'm starting to understand, the things you create with your own hands, those are the ones that truly matter. Thank you." Below was the clumsy signature of my son, the boy who once thought his mother was too old to begin again. I folded the letter, slipped it into my notebook. Then I stood up, stepped outside the bakery and welcomed the first sunlight of a new day. If you've ever been told it's too late to start over, remember this: sometimes the sweetest things only come when you dare to begin again.